Better not touch it, I might get in trouble. Well, at least the most vital function, the air conditioning, is on, so we can be comfortable this morning. If you will go back into your study of comparative religion, you will suddenly realize that practically every belief and tradition of man has importance to us today. This importance, of course, may be essentially symbolical, but the experience of the race is moved from deep archetypal sources within life itself. And this morning we want to mention particularly ancient and even surviving primitive rites relating to the orientation of the individual into the tribal or family life of which he is a part. In ancient times, young persons growing up went through a series of initiations. These initiations were intended to bring the young person to the state of citizenship. A citizenship which meant personal acceptance of responsibility in the communal life. We have neglected these ceremonies for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, and we now regard them very largely as superstitions. Yet as we study the situation more carefully, we begin to perceive the original meaning. And this meaning is not, by any means, merely a superstition. The young parent of today, starting out raising a family, has to restore this mystery ritual in their own control and direction of their children. The bringing of children through the difficult periods of childhood and adolescence, and finally to maturity, means the perpetuation of symbolic ritualistic processes, whether we know them by name or not. Actually, however, when we must conjure these out of our own immaturity, with no reference frame to the traditional way by which this is accomplished, we often proceed by trial and error, and endure too many trials and cause too many errors. Actually, the only way today in which this can be done is through a certain amount of study, reflection, and a gradually increasing knowledge of how the child psychology works. The ritual process has as its basis the release or orientation of the individual as a creative unit. Maturity is creativity. Maturity is not mere obedience in the sense of following only in the traditional ways. Maturity is the victory of the self over the various problems of growth and orientation. The parent must therefore achieve for the child a leadership which is to lead to creativity and not to subordination. Now, this is a difficult problem because young children are by nature insubordinate. And it is often a difficult matter to guide them without hurting them, protect them without smothering them, lead them without pushing them, and performing these delicate functions of a combination of protection and release. This was the problem of the initiation rituals. It was the purpose of these rituals to gradually, psychologically, impress upon the growing person that he was growing into selfhood, that he was not growing up to become like his ancestors in the sense of merely the extension of them. He was not growing up merely to perpetuate his culture. This he might have to do. But patriotism was more than defending the thing as it is. Patriotism is the power to improve the thing as it is. The duty is to protect and to advance at the same time. The young person in our modern way of life is, generally speaking, here in the West, unequipped for personal creativity. He comes to his maturity as a member of a team, but unfortunately the captain of the team holds nearly all of the dynamic prerogatives. In our way of life, we shudder at the desperate danger of individualization. We fear the individual who will not be like the rest. We have established rules. We punch time clocks. We pay people to do what we tell them to, and we expect them to follow our instruction. Our entire economy is based upon the individual submerging himself to some common task. This in itself is not necessarily dangerous. In tribal life, the citizen had to submerge his own interests whenever the need of the group became critical, or whenever the problem of group survival confronted him. At the same time, he was, however, instructed with certain values, so that he did not merely continuously protect or defend. He contributed. And his religion in those times was closely associated with this contribution. He served God through the release of his own selfhood by becoming a person, by becoming a real individual. He was therefore able to release into society the best part of his own creative life. The young person today faces many restrictions that primitive man never knew. One of the great and continuous restrictions is education. And sometime we must face education as it was in ancient times, not merely a process of indoctrination, but a process of initiation into maturity. With this factor left out, education becomes merely a forcing of the exterior upon the internal. It means that we hang trappings upon the individual. We dress him. We adorn him with the ornaments of our own already achieved accomplishments. But we do not fit him for personal achievement in most cases. And we also limit his natural instinct toward creativity. This brings the ancient concept right down into our lives. The next step in this same procedure is the relationship between adults. Today, this relationship is very largely dominated. In almost every pattern that we confront, persons work together because one leads and the other follows. the moment both persons try to lead, there is an impact of conflict. We are not accustomed in our way of life to experience creativity in others without being impelled to dominate it. We struggle desperately to preserve our own, and frequently this struggle leads us to an unconscious inclination to dominate others in terms of our own freedom. For us, therefore, freedom implies the right to influence others, whereas freedom actually means the right to express self. We imply that self-expression must always curtail the self-expression of someone else, that it is necessary for our happiness and security not only that we reveal our inner life, but that we impose this life upon the lives of others. Here then we come again to a ritualistic problem, a problem that antiquity worked with, perhaps subconsciously, but in many ways very effectively. Because life was rather more simple in those times than it is now, there were many more experiences possible to the individual without this sense of dominance. In those days, for example, men were protected by the simple belief that creativity was not merely an expression of themselves. Creativity, as we find it expressed in the dialogues of Socrates, was a daemon or spirit, a muse or a divine power operating through man. This concept was highly useful, for it not only gave the person a greater sense of the security of his own conviction, because this conviction emanated from deity, but also required others to respect this conviction, because to oppose the right of the other person to be a person was to assail divinity. We do not have this factor strong enough today, however, to protect the right of creative expression. We no longer assume that our greater attributes are God-given. We rather like to assume they are our own. And because they are our own, other persons who also have similar or parallel attitudes and instincts, which they also feel to be their own, feel perfectly justified in a warfare between their own and our own, a warfare which would not be nearly so critical had we the concept that antiquity had, that greatness flows from a common fountain, and that all things by nature right are also by nature God. The competition between man and man is more possible than the competition between man and God. And even in our time, we are not inclined to declare war on the divine factor. Even among materialistic persons who have very little sympathy for religion themselves, it is an unwritten law not to interfere too strongly with the religious rights of others. To do so is to be distinctly unpopular. All this leads to the main consideration of the morning, namely the presence in the individual of a conflict between himself and an ancestral pattern. This ancestral pattern may be regarded as a parental archetype or a parental image. And within ourselves, authority of origin is consistently and continuously divided. We are impelled at one moment to move outward from authority, and at another moment we are impelled to move outward from self. Today, in the West particularly, we move outward very largely from authority, because psychologically authority is strong in our consciousness, and individual action or selfness is not so strong. The self of man represents something. It is a focal point. It is an identity, a core of individuation. It is a center of personal acceptance of existence or of life. It is the self that no one knows. We do not know it ourselves, but we postulate it, for from it is an ever-flowing source of selfness. And this selfness is apparently inexhaustible. There seems to be no reason to assume that we will, for a long time, perhaps for millions of years, actually become aware of the fullness of self. For this awareness can only come from the total experience of self, and self being almost infinite. The total experience is continuous to infinity, and we are not certain that we can exhaust this experience. Self, as we may term it, floats or rests like an island in the midst of an ocean of that which is not self. That which is not self does not mean non-existent, negative, or in any way essentially a contrast to the nature or substance of self. But this great sea of unconsciousness in which the self rests precariously is not a thing, it is the thing. This universal sea has an everything about it. It may be described in the terms of all, or most, or many, or much. When we say to a person, well, everyone knows that this is the proper answer, that word everyone stands for the unconscious. It stands for this thing that you cannot measure or weigh. And when hastily spoken, the term everyone may mean only one person. It is merely a figure created for emphasis. It is a bad bit of semantics. Or perhaps this everyone grows up to mean our family, which is in agreement with us, perhaps by necessity. Can't live with us any other way. Or everyone may be the members of our political party. It's hard to get them together, so again, it's a loose statement. It may mean the members of our religion. Or if we happen to be in the insurance business, it may be the common opinion of the actuaries. But everyone is simply a whole word. Not W-H, but H-O-L-E. It is just an empty center surrounded by a strong defense. This type of everything, all things, everyone, and stretching out into such other large terms as coincidence, circumstances, even tradition, the old way, the concept that all good people do it this way. All of these kind of terms are symbols for this unconsciousness. for this thing that can be anything. When the individual starts to move, therefore, he may move from the ego center or selfness, or he may move from this allness, his own unconscious. If he moves from selfness, he will probably move more or less rationally, but perhaps very slowly and awkwardly, because he is not used to personal decision on anything. The moment he is confronted with a personal decision, he rushes to his lawyer, his doctor, his counselor, or talks over the back fence with his neighbor. Any possible means of dividing responsibility. The end of this being that if it goes wrong, he can always insist that someone else is to blame. This type of reaction reveals clearly the weakness of the self-orientation. The unconscious orientation is even more troublesome. It has one aspect in which the individual is trying to survive by being like the all. And as the all produces out of itself the occasional exceptional example of its own peculiarities, we have a kind of leadership which in the modern world is very likely to be dangerous, because the more persons it represents, the less clearly defined it is. Unless we wish to swing into the extreme negative and realize that out of the weakness of the all, out of the non-organization of the all, out of the fear and doubt of the all, may emerge by dynamic contrast the all personified, as in the case, for example, of Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini. Men who had all of the fears of the negative all and floated upon the surface of the tremendous common pressure of national or racial discontent. The all also has a negative phase that is very depressing and difficult. In the all, anything can be true. And where anything can be true, we are in a serious disadvantage. We may say to ourselves, the worst may be true. And out of this negative all factor comes fear. Fear is therefore the pressures of the unknown, slowly submerging the little island of selfness, which is the area of the potentially known. The more the unknown floods over the known, the more complete the domination of fear will become. Fear is not necessarily the only possible interpretation of the all quality, but it is a common one, because fear removes orientation. It forces the individual to live against a hole in the dark, the unknown. And to man, the unknown is menacing because of his own relationship to it, his relationship being that of ignorance. And the less defined a thing may be, the more difficult it is for the person to take an enlightened attitude toward it. The all, therefore, becomes mystery. And this mere or wonderful unconsciousness is a mother of mysteries, a strange and fantastic value level in which there is too much burden for the person to bear. Now this all, moving in upon us in our own experience, becomes the tremendous parental value or relationship in which the individual, standing at a certain point in time and place, stands under the broad shadow of a total world situation. He stands in the presence of all that has gone before. He stands in the presence of the modifications of his own ancestry upon his body and his mind. He stands in the presence of the modifications caused by the Pilgrim Fathers when they landed at Plymouth Rock. He stands in the presence of the modifications resulting from the Inquisition, from the fall of the Roman Empire, from the collapse of Egypt. He stands in the presence of the wars, 8,000 wars recorded in history. And it is unlikely that the consequences of a single one of those wars has ever actually terminated. Now, under such conditions, history, biology, heredity, environment, racial specializations, religious convictions, political and scientific attitudes, all these things together become a vast flood. And this flood has as its final obvious function the submerging of the island of self. It goes down like some mysterious fabled Atlantis under the tremendous storm and pressure of conditions on the outside. In this sense, therefore, we all experience the unconscious. We all experience these strange motions and pressures which we cannot trace to any logical or reasonable cause. They are more powerful because they are unreasonable. They are more difficult to control because they are not logical. Yet the pressure of them goes on. If man, therefore, moves from this unconscious level of himself, he moves from pressures. He moves from ancient, almost inconceivably remote causations. He also responds with the most primitive elements of his own nature. And he finds himself merely part of the ages. He finds himself unable to fulfill his own maturity. He cannot use the ages as a foundation upon which to build, because the ages themselves continue to flow through him with such force and such power that he is constantly required to obey them, never to become an individual, never to release his own personal power in this situation. It is therefore with some reason that psychologists have liked to think of this tremendous unconsciousness which pressures us continuously as a kind of parental. This parental, which may be either father or mother, usually prevents us from accepting the challenge of our own personal growth. Each time in life we come up through childhood and infancy, we again experience this parental domination on ourselves immediately. Everything that belongs to the collective pressure is revitalized for us in the individual pressures under which we ourselves fall. These pressures are not always unpleasant. Sometimes they are very delightful. But they can be enervating as well as disconcerting. These pressures can rob us of our natural vitality. They can spoil us. They can make life appear too easy for us. We can think, for example, that we are indebted to the past for security. because the past has conquered certain evils, that the past has made it possible for us to grow up today with better health because of sanitation. We can recognize all these things as emanating from the past and being part of its collectivity. We can accept with gratitude. But if this acceptance becomes so complete that we become only accepting creatures, living off of the bounty of the past, we will destroy the present. Just exactly as a prosperous generation, losing sight of the need for reasonable economy and expecting something like the present inflation to go on forever, comes to the conclusion that life is merely an opportunity to be extravagant. And this situation pyramids through the common support of the thoughtless until finally they destroy their own prosperity. This can happen wherever this so-called hereditary or traditional privilege is abused. And it is a natural indication or symbol of early childhood to be dependent and obedient to collective pressure. We find this again in our adult thinking. We find that the patterns generally accepted as being correct at the time seem to have a strength about them, and we are impelled to follow them, just as we are impelled to follow styles, and just as we at the present time are impelled with the psychosis of modernity. Today, as one person noted not long ago, particularly referring to the California atmosphere, anything created yesterday is out of date and will be completely destroyed by tomorrow in order to make place for something else which in turn will be destroyed the next day. We now have this tremendous worship of the new. What is it? It is psychic rebellion. It is the self trying to assert itself. But being inexperienced, and because all small things are deformed, this small impulse is well out of shape. We go to extreme, just as the child leaving home for the first time and feeling its liberty may move to a very excessive position. So the individual fighting to regain selfhood in the presence of pressure often goes to ridiculous extremes and thereby brings condemnation or criticism upon the whole concept of progress. Progress is and must be a smooth motion, but it cannot be a smooth motion where it must be attained constantly by each Siegfried slaying the dragon of totality before he can be himself. Because this dragon is forever guarding the treasures of the Nibelung, the treasures which result from the unfoldment of personal consciousness. Rebellion is the individual slaying the dragon. But usually he is not too careful what dragon he slays, or the circumstances, because the pressure between the unconscious and the self has become so acute that it has not led to creativity directly, but to revolution, to a tremendous, perhaps violent reaction, by which we turn upon tradition and attempt to destroy it utterly. As the old saying goes, why, we burn down the church to get rid of the rat in the basement. And this is a natural tendency where the repressions have been too great. Religion presents an interesting problem in the relationship between selfhood and what we might term the unconscious allness. Religion has as its primary purpose the orientation and integration of the inner life of man. It has to do with the creation of those basic instincts by which man begins to experience his own potential. The concept with God, all things are possible, has a special meaning if we assume a God in man. Religion, therefore, points out the wealth of the potential of power within the individual. That this wealth of potential is of divine origin, and that the development of it is man's proper personal responsibility, and that his growth must be an orderly unfoldment of life within his own nature. That he should avoid, if possible, all violence and all destructiveness, but should integrate his selfness around the God concept. Therefore, to a degree, God becomes a problem, because God can be, again, this difficult, mysterious allness pushing in and causing the individual to be of the opinion that anything he cannot explain is divine, that any impulse which is not rational is religious. And this is not true. Every impulse that comes from within us does not bespeak our divinity. It may bespeak not only merely our humanity, but may arise from nothing but biochemical irritation. Many a person who believes he has had a direct wire with the infinite has really nothing the matter with him except a touch of acidosis. Thus, while the concept of deity as all is valuable to us, and is essentially true, in which all is merely undifferentiated potential, but in our practical way of life, deity has to express itself in a particular way, and this has been sensed or known by theology in the presentation of its basic Trinity. To us, therefore, the allness of God must appear in the aspect of deity as parent, and in this case as father, or father-mother, and the first aspect of deity is creativity, God the Creator. As God the Creator, therefore, the allness moves into the psychological root of selfness, giving us the concept that the divine power is eternally creating, and is therefore in a continuous state of creative manifestation, and that man, attempting to be like God, or to experience God, or to experience the presence of God in himself, must do so by experiencing the all-creativity of God, rather than merely the being of God. This problem of the all-creativity of the parent opens to us a world of action and helps us to escape from creedalism, which is actually an acceptance and not an action. That which we do results in experience, which becomes a positive factor in the integration of selfness. That which we accept, listen to, read about, but do not apply, results in no personal experience, and therefore has a very definite tendency to fall back into the collective unconscious. It simply becomes mass again, because it does not lead to directive. in our own personal experience. Thus, in religion, there is a continuous conflict between parent-child. The parent in religion is the great, total, unconscious religious substance. It is religion as the unconscious. The emergence of selfness in religion has been dignified by the appearance of the great religious teachers. Buddha, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Jesus, Mohammed, these represent the heroic selves of religion. They also represent religion transformed into an action, into a code, so that the lives of these persons and the way they lived, these values begin to take dominance over the theological factors themselves. And we are reminded of the words, "If ye love me, keep my commandments." And it is in this keeping of commandments that we move from the blind pressures of the unconscious to the integrated planning of the self-center in ourselves. I do not refer to self now as selfishness, but as individualized existence in being. It is only an individualized existence which can determine anything. The individual without selfness can be neither good nor bad, because he has no moral distinction and no influence over his own conduct. Therefore, selfness is indispensable to ethics, to morality, or to the establishment of a personal conduct, which in turn becomes a personal religion. The conflict then broke out in this continuous procedure of religious reform. The moment a religion fell into totality again, it was strengthened or restated by a reformer arising. The purpose of the reformer being to adjust once more this collective unconscious of religion to the immediate pressing conscious needs of individuals. So out of the collective we have men like Luther rising out to prevent religion from falling back into total traditionalism. The great divisions that we have in religion, of course, for the most part, are termed orthodox and unorthodox, and among the terms we recognize that the word unorthodox was most anciently and commonly applied to the dissenter, and the dissenter was usually a mystic. Therefore, mysticism, which is the personal experience of God, is thrown against traditionalism, which is the common acceptance of God as a result of doctrine, dogma, or credo. So our psychological pattern comes through again. This same pattern of the problem of the individual getting away from the influence of family. It makes no difference whether this family is his church, or whether this family is his race, or this family is his generation, the time in which he lives. The supreme purpose which is felt within the individual is his instinct to be himself. Now, this instinct in the young person frequently leads to tragedy. And it can also lead to tragedy in the psychological growth of the individual. But nearly always, the tremendous desire to escape is intensified in ratio to the pressure of the bondage. The individual who is unreasonably held will ultimately be the one with the most violent rebellion within his own nature. And as Comenius pointed out, the answer to this in the terms of the child is that from the beginning the child shall not be unreasonably held. Now, this does not mean it shall be permitted to grow up without discipline or without control. But it shall be taught, as Comenius pointed out, as early as possible, that discipline is not the arbitrary will of the parents, that the purpose of the child is primarily not to obey the parent, but the purpose of the child is to obey the law which both the parent and the child must obey together. This is a very vital point, and the only correction for it is in modern society, is that the parent shall no longer do those things which it criticizes the child for doing. Because actually, as the child grows, the relationship of the unconscious or the parent to the child must change. And gradually, the parent must become objectified also as a person. And the child must recognize finally, that as it grows up, that the parental position changes. And whereas in infancy the parent has to be almost autocratic in relation to the child, when the child reaches adulthood, the relationship between parent and child must gradually have evolved until it is fraternal, until the concept arises or emerges that the parent and the child are both united in the common search for reality, and that it is not merely a parent's opinion being forced as reality upon the child. Comenius was of the conviction that if the parental attitude is right, and to it is added a reasonable amount of intelligent religious directive, and that if the educational facilities are quietly and not too dramatically introduced, that the child's relationship to itself, its parents, its world, its education, that these can be normalized and ordered so that in the majority of cases the child is essentially correctly oriented even before it learns to read. It is oriented by a series of simple experiences. And because the inner life of the individual reacts archetypally to experience, it will react most dramatically to right experience if it is permitted to do so. But if it is conditioned against right experience at a time too young, then it is unable to use its own intuitive faculties correctly. To carry the problem a little further into the congested life of the adult individual, we realize that there is a tremendous amount of conflict in the average person of today. That this conflict is gravitating against national security, world security. That more intimately it is gravitating against domestic felicity. It is gravitating against adequate employment and employment remuneration. It is responsible for the cultivation of numerous bad social habits, and it is taking the peace of mind and rest away from millions of our people. That such a condition should go comparatively unnoticed, or that the correction of it should be regarded as a luxury to be gotten around to sometime if other things permit. Such an attitude, of course, will ultimately lead to a very serious crisis in world affairs. Usually, however, by the time a general pattern gets to this condition, we lose its proper boundaries. For instance, by the time that the Roman Empire fell to the barbarians, situations had been so complex in the Roman life that when it happened, everybody pointed victoriously to the barbarian. no one assumed in Rome that the Roman was responsible. Maybe he had been a little too patient, maybe he had been a little too indifferent while the barbarians were approaching. But what he could not and did not realize was that the fall of Rome was actually the result of a psychological situation that extended over 500 years, and having remained uncorrected in the individual, ultimately destroyed the collective. And when it did destroy the collective, the individual found it difficult to learn his lesson, because he saw only the fall of the collective, and saw no reason to assume that he was responsible. Now, this happens too frequently. And if it happens again, we shall all be bitterly antagonistic against the outside enemy. But we shall have no general thought for the internal situation, which was the real cause. Because the outside enemy is merely a catalyst, merely a mirror, in which the psychological weakness of the situation is reflected back, appearing to come from the outside, but actually coming from the inside. To meet this situation, then, we have to realize that many symptoms point to what might be termed psychological parental domination. That it is not just the domination of physical parents, perhaps they weren't very dominant, but it is parent as ancestor, parent as collective tradition, parent as common mind, parent as the past, or the way things always have been done, or parent in the form of the impulse to unreasonable conformity. All these moving in upon the individual have their more common effects. Kindly parents nearly always are guilty of spoiling children. And as we look around, comparing the tantrums of a spoiled child to the general situation, we realize that in some way we are a generation of spoiled children. We have much more than we know how to use well, and we have little, if any, gratitude for anything. To us, life is the privilege to do as we think we want to, and with as little responsibility or common interest as possible. These are indications, therefore, of the spoiled child. They are the indications of individuals who have been under a certain type of traditional pressure. The traditional pressure of success, the traditional pressure of believing in high standards of living, the traditional pressures by means of which, for example, we have ceased to recognize the fraternity and cooperative of family. The child who never helps the family can grow into the adult who never helps anybody. The individual who finds his own childhood without responsibility will become a perpetual adolescent and will attempt to live his life in his world without responsibility, and will turn viciously upon anyone or anything which requires responsibility from him. The only way to correct these situations is to get them as quickly as possible and work with them. One very definite pattern that we have is the happiness pattern. What makes us happy? Most people apparently do not know, because they say that if they knew, they'd be doing it. And most persons are not especially happy. Some of them look reasonably comfortable, and of course, if we can believe the advertising, there are thousands of products that will make you deliriously happy for a comparatively small investment. So we invest in all of them and we're still miserable. The problem of happiness has to do with maturity. The immature person has very little power of real happiness. And happiness also has to do with creativity. The individual who is fulfilling is happy. The person who either has nothing to fulfill or does not know what fulfillment means cannot truly be happy. Fulfillment does not mean to keep busy. Although this is sometimes a psychosomatic correlative. The individual who keeps busy is coming a little nearer to the law and therefore has certain benefits, fringe benefits perhaps. But the real purpose is not merely to keep busy. The real purpose is to do the things which are within the range of man as a creative being. Happiness is fulfillment. It is living from within the self and causing this living to be rich in benefits to those around us. Happiness is the power to accept experience, and happiness is itself an experience. It is the experience of having kept the rules, of having done those things which were right and proper for the individual to do. Happiness is not escape from responsibility, nor the acceptance of false responsibility. Happiness is the state of recognizing the value of responsibility and to find in the fulfillment of need a quiet and enduring satisfaction. The useless can never be happy. The selfish can never be happy. The individual who is bound to tradition too deeply cannot be happy. Yet for modern man, complete freedom from tradition is also a difficulty. He knows this, and he performs an action for which he frequently kicks himself, but which he cannot resist the impulse to perform. The moment he gets out of a responsibility, he goes and looks for another one. The individual, for example, who during his childhood and growing up toward his maturity, spent his entire time practically helping to care for a younger sister who had polio and was hopelessly incapacitated. This young man finally grew up, started out in life, and this responsibility was taken away. What did he do? He married a crippled girl and took care of her the rest of his life. Why? Because he had become accustomed to responsibility. It was necessary to him. It was his pattern. And the moment the individual is without a problem, he instinctively goes and looks for one. This is again archetypal. It is part of the self trying to assert its strength. The self is never really happy unless it is performing a positive and clear-cut service. It is never itself without being the helpful self. Now, help is fine as long as it doesn't carry the impulse of domination. And the helpful self is one in which there must be a victory of internal effort over external situations. We call this also fair competition in sport. We believe in sportsmanship. We believe in the best man winning. And we are always hoping that we will be the best man. But many have realized the magnificence and the dignity of the good loser. It is not whether we win or lose that is the primary problem. The problem is, what have we learned? How much have we grown? And how much better are we than we were before this incident occurred? So we are frequently found trying to escape our own dependence or our own childhood by assuming a parental job ourselves. You'll remember the small boys who years ago used to put on artificial beards to look like big, bad men. Now, you may have also noticed that in recent months there has been a slight tendency to the restoration of chin whiskers among the American male. These are generally referred to as the beatniks or something of that nature. But in all probabilities, the individual who once saw one of these characters in a particularly luxurious arrangement said, I think he's trying to look like God. He was, and didn't know it. He was trying to look like ancestor. He was trying to bolster up a positive situation in his own nature. And this kind of symbolism goes on and on and on. It is the natural desire of the small child to play grown up. It wants to be like a grown-up person. And unless the grown-up person becomes so difficult that finally the child loses all desire to be like them, or gets a highly revengeful attitude on the subject, the natural tendency of the child is to want to accept the situation of leadership. Now, the child doesn't analyze this psychologically. Probably all the child is interested in is the fact that someday it will be big enough to give the orders rather than to obey them. But this is the point involved. Tradition is forever demanding obedience, whereas creativity is forever doing for itself in its own way those things which are next. Escape from tradition is therefore escape to self. And if the escape is dominated by too much violence, it simply means that the pressures against selfhood have become too heavy in the situation at hand. So we all want to be selves. We all want to become part of a positive pattern of leadership. There are really only two kinds of persons that we know of in society. One is the individual who wants to lead or does lead, and the other is the person who wants to be led or is led because they never do anything about it. Therefore, the leader and the follower, these are the inevitable patterns. Nature is distinctly attempting to create leaders. Man, because of the resistance of tradition, and because of this peculiar inertia resulting from the lack of strong self-individuation, is forever content to be led. And where we have too many followers, we have correspondingly few leaders. And where we have very few leaders, we have very few directives for followers. Plato points this out in the study of the governments of the world, particularly democracy. He points out that democracy can only work when every citizen of the nation is personally equipped to occupy the highest office. The only way it can make it work. Because only when each citizen is a fully self-directing person can he voluntarily give his allegiance. And there is a very great difference between voluntarily giving your allegiance and having this allegiance demanded of you. The individual who has a strong individuality can give it away. But the individual who has nothing and wants to share it with everyone is a rather sad spectacle. To give away certain of our freedoms may be a symbol of social necessity. We do this voluntarily. We are not disturbed because we know what we are doing. But where we are forced to give away certain of our freedoms against our wills for ends which we do not understand and of which we may not approve, then we have anxiety, we have discord, we have conflict in ourselves. So it is always the right of the strong to be gracious. But the weak actually have no rights because they have no control over themselves. And without self-control, you can never give anything. To correct this situation in our modern religious and philosophic life means that strength alone can be meek. That only that which has its own integration can share or give or sacrifice intelligently and purposefully for anything else. And where this integration is correct, the impulse to share and to give, such impulse is very strong and very real. If, however, we have not this integration, we then give from tradition or from pattern or share because we are expected to, and deprive ourselves of the most important element in experience. The most important element being the experience of self-decision. And this decision is undermined if outside authority continues to dominate us beyond a reasonable point. Philosophy also points out that what we call outside authority is simply internal authority that has passed through crystallization and has moved out into environment to create institution. Actually, all institutions began with man himself. The great structures that we know began as ideas inside of people. And in various ways, over vast periods of time, these ideas have come out and have become institutionalized. But we have to realize that an institution differs from an individual in one essential difference or value, namely that the institution is not a soul. The institution is not a thing capable of perpetuating itself out of itself. It is not a thing in itself creative. An institution is a body. And the reason this body appears to live is because men supply their life to it. Now, when an institution enters into a state of matter, it is very much like the physical body. Once the human being builds his physical body, he has to live with it. When he cannot live with it any longer, he passes out of it. Man, having created institutions, must then proceed to live with them. The difference, of course, being that man is capable of changing his mind in an instant, whereas if he wishes to make this change visible in an established institution, it may take him 500 years to chisel it into the new look. Consequently, his institutions will usually lag behind him. At the time he creates them, they are the soul of progress. 100 years later, they are still there, sitting like the old man of the sea on his back. He has outgrown them in his own experience, but he must abide by them because of the strength which they have received as physical corporate entities. Thus, to be dominated by institution is to be dominated by a long roundabout procedure. And it is also nearly always to be subjected to extreme conservatism and reactionary situations. This, under some conditions, is necessary in an organized society. It is not the part of wisdom to take things and toss them around. We do not announce fixedly and determinately that we are going to overthrow anything. But we have to recognize where value comes from. And according to our Western way of life, the purpose of an institution is to serve us, and not that we shall spend the rest of our time in bondage to the institution. If this be the fact of the matter, then institutions, being merely machines run by people, it becomes very important that the people who run them shall be contemporary, that these people shall be creative, and that these persons shall have the wisdom, the skill, and the courage to make these institutions continually readjusted to now. And there's where one of our lags has been. Where the individual moves from within himself, he moves from now. Where he moves into conformity with institution, he is moved yesterday, or by an age or a century. And perhaps this is implied by Plato when he says that most of the living is ruled by the dead. We are always ruled by the dead if we are ruled by yesterday. This does not mean that we reject yesterday any more than we reject parent. But we use yesterday upon which to build through further experience. The individual who stops growing yesterday gets to look very much like an ancient institution in a short while. It is not that yesterday is worthless, but that yesterday must always be the foundation for today. Now and here something must be done. This yesterday must be taken hold of. It must be changed, modified, and adjusted. It must be strengthened through the increase of common knowledge which has been attained since yesterday. And it must be passed on to the new artisans of tomorrow with the best possible equipment, as nearly perfect as we can make it. Nor should we in any way so dominate this thing we are doing that it will be impossible for tomorrow to do anything with it. And where we establish long-range provisos that nothing must change for 100 years, we are simply defeating ourselves. It is very important that change shall always be available when necessary. Otherwise, we lose progress. Our own lives must likewise, from a contemporary standpoint, be freed from the misery and miasma of yesterday. Yesterday becomes the parental hole. It becomes the womb of the present misery. And the individual who lives in the past has gone back to live with his ancestors. He wouldn't think, for instance, of going back to a cave and trying to make fire by rubbing two sticks together. But he is just exactly in the same spot if he tries to perpetuate the feuds of his family or continues to live on nothing but the miserable memories of how things were 40 years ago. He might just as well go back to the cave and start fighting saber-toothed tigers. He's doing precisely the same thing. And it makes very little difference whether he goes back to that cave on foot or in an 8-cylinder automobile. The moment he lives in the past, he is going back to the past. He is escaping to childhood. He is trying to escape back to darkness. For actually, all of the negative thoughts that have come to dominate him are gradually regressing into oblivion, and he will land there with them if he keeps up the process long enough. So escape from yesterday is a symptom or symbol of the statement of self over circumstance. The individual who lives, therefore, in the sense of integration, lives in the sense of being able to move forward without, first of all, climbing through, if he can, some deep morass of things that have bound him. The past binds no one except psychologically. The dead can only rule us because we permit it. And the old can only destroy the new because we allow it to do so. Therefore, the constant need for recognizing this release from the parent pattern. Now, it might sound as though all of this is going to work quite a hardship on the dignity of parenthood. It isn't. Because the dignity of parenthood is not the thing we're talking about. What we're talking about is the psychological abuse of it. We today can state frankly with Sir Isaac Newton that we see further than our ancestors did because we are standing on the shoulders of giants. Everything that has gone before is useful to us. The parent is the symbol of protection through the formative period of life. The parent is the symbol of honest help. The parent is the symbol of the honest doctor, the honest lawyer, the honest businessman. The parent is the symbol of that which we must depend on, and the unknown which we must hope to be good in order to survive. The parent is tremendously valuable to us. But the parent is not valuable in the sense of being a tyrant, nor in the sense of some decadent aristocracy. The parent is not something we have to get down on our knees and worship. It is something we must get up on our feet and prove we are grateful for. The achievement, therefore, of the individual can be and should be a dedicated monument to the love and strength and faith that has helped to bring him to maturity. And the biggest thing he can do for his parents is to achieve that maturity. If they by any chance are not able to understand this, it is then the problem of the young person to try to help them to understand, realizing that duty to parent means finally the fulfillment of that which is right, rather than catering to something which is not right. Actually, we are all here today only because of this vast ancestral complex. We are here not only physically, but psychologically, intellectually, morally, and spiritually because of the world that has gone before. It has been a wonderful experience, but each generation has not been kindly in passing on the patterns of this experience. That is why our world has been so mutilated, and why we in the 20th century have not overcome the simple faults and evils that dominated 5,000 years ago. We have never approached this problem in the true sense of the old initiation rites. We have never realized our own duty to become contemporary individuals, serving the things we know to be right. We bring the fruit of the harvest to the eternal God, which is the old and the new. We recognize the patriarchs and the saints standing far off and aloof, representing the old traditional truths which never change. But our duty is not merely to get down and worship them. Our duty is to get up and work and bring to these principles the harvests of our works. In the ancient times, men brought to the temple the first fruit of the fields and the firstborn of the flocks. They brought their works. They did not hide their talents in the earth. They used their talents and were rewarded with greater opportunity and responsibility. The problem in every generation has been this battle between the power of things as they always have been and the tremendous urge of the individual to be himself. Things as they always have been will remain that way, age after age, unless the power of the person to be himself is revealed. Unless he recognizes another mystery which was spoken of in the Bible, unless he becomes like the mysterious priest after the order of Melchizedek, who is his own father and his own mother. Actually, his own creativity cause him to be archetypally parental. And no individual is finally free simply because he escapes from parent. He is only free when he becomes parent, as the final symbol of his maturity. He becomes parent as artist, creating great art, as musician, creating great music. He becomes parent psychologically, philosophically, religiously, biologically. But he must always create. The final proof of his citizenship is creativity. That he is caused to come from himself that which shall survive himself, and shall also add to the wealth, power, and authority of the things that are to come in the future. So when the small boy was taken through the rites of the tribe, his milk name was taken from him. The name of the child was removed, and he was told very simply that it was the nature of the child to be dependent, that it was the nature of the child to play. It was the nature of the child to expect others to feed him, clothe him, take care of him. It was the nature of the child that they should also protect him against sickness, instruct him, correct him, and prepare him for life. That these things were the natural work of the child that he should forever receive. And in receiving, he should remember and store away those things which he had received as a priceless heritage of parental guidance. But when he came into the temple, he was given a new name, his own name. He was no longer the son of this or the daughter of that person. He now had a name of his own. And this name he had to earn. And whenever his name was spoken, he must answer. His parents could no longer answer for him. He must answer. If his name is accused, he must defend himself. If his name is applauded or awarded, he is to receive that applause or that award. If there is work to do and he is called, he must answer. For he is now a person making his own decisions, a person dependent upon himself for his own courage, that he should make these decisions and arrive at them more wisely because he has been properly guided by his parents is true. They have helped to give him this means. And if they have not given him the power and the wisdom and the courage to make up his own mind, they have failed him. His respect for his parents, like his respect for his teacher, his local chieftain, his God, This respect is real and should always exist. For no individual should ever lose respect for that which has been the source of good. All these things and the common affections of life are undisturbed. In fact, the child, so integrated, can be a great deal more joy, a great deal more help, and a great deal more strength to parents than would otherwise be possible. The child does not depart from parental responsibility, but does it not as duty, but as chosen task. Out of personal understanding, we have those gracious deeds that truly make parents happy. But out of duty, we have grudging services that are as hard to receive as they are to give. Therefore, the right attitude, the child becoming a self, and as a self, choosing to be gracious, means that the full weight of that child's life and love come with it when it serves. But to create this desired condition, the self must begin to emerge, must emerge as self-responsible, self-directive, and self-corrective. It must also see that there is something in the common way that can be improved, and that life, therefore, is a dedication to the correction of things known to be imperfect, and that each individual has within him a creativity that can contribute, and that each person in his own way and according to his own insight should contribute is right. But he cannot contribute if he is under the kind of pressure which forbids him to be himself. So the release of self is not merely to run away, to escape. The release of self is to place maturity upon the life, that it shall guide it, direct it, and inspire it from that time on, and that the works of that life shall be works of maturity, of use and value to all others. In this way, the person is also led naturally to parenthood, which is creativity, and the experience of having enriched life and enriched self. These are the rewards which lead to happiness, peace of mind, and peace of soul. For our peace of mind and soul come not because we do what others do, give a little and keep a lot. The peace of mind and peace of soul come when the individual realizes that with his own understanding and with his own insight and of his own will and accord, he has chosen to be the greatest good to the greater number. These things bring him security. He faces life serenely and the life beyond with a good hope. No more can be asked. He must, however, escape from this ogre image of domination and find that with freedom he does not develop license, that liberty does not make him reject his responsibilities, but gives him the right to personally choose to carry them. As we begin to see through this, we begin to recognize how the parental image will come through in him on a new level of creativity. Parenthood will go on, but every generation of parenthood will be wiser and better, not because it has copied the past, but because it has released its own insight with each generation. We will then not be faced with antique problems that are never solved. We shall be faced with new and wonderful opportunities that can challenge our ability to solve them and which will continue to protect us as creative beings. We must therefore come out from under the inertia which arises from being immersed in the protective organism with which we associate childhood. We must emerge into the freedom of self-protection, of self-discipline, of self-directive. For only in these achievements can we make this better world and preserve the rights which we already have. If we can preserve the present rights, we have done something. If we can make them righter and go on to correct those faults which now threaten us, we shall be still more correct in our conduct. And all this correctness, all this service, finally ties to our religious concept, because the self in man is seeking to be like the self in God. And this is the self which is in all things bestowing, in all things eternally creating, in all things agelessly benevolent. With these concepts in our unconscious and in our conscious gradually moving through, we can transform parenthood from a symbolic thing to an experienced reality of growth, which is the end we so definitely need to attain. Time's up. Time's up. Next week we have a very interesting subject which I believe you will enjoy. There's been some recent research on this. We're going to bring it in and try to tie the whole pattern as closely as we can. Ghosts, premonitions, and visions as psychological phenomena. Recent experimentation in many phases of what has been known as psychic phenomena shows how strongly the point that we made many years ago is, namely, that most psychical phenomena has psychological factors, and that what we so often think of as the supernatural is merely this internal pressure in ourselves, moving through various symbolical and somatic forms. And I think we have a very interesting and important subject. In connection with the talk of this morning, there are a number of our publications that you may find of interest to you. I think perhaps one that would help you would be Self-Unfoldment, which has to do with the directing of these inner attitudes and concepts. For a broad survey of religious archetypes, our 12 world teachers will help, because these, of course, represent the selves that have emerged in the great unconscious of religion. We have one of our manuscript lectures on the table this morning, How to Prepare for a Fortunate Rebirth. And also I note that we have a set of the work, The Great Initiates, by Edouard Chouret, a very good work. It is the book, incidentally, by which the life of Jesus has been most closely associated with the Essene sect. So if you're interested in our used books, we have some very nice ones. Don't forget to look around a little while you're here. You may notice we have some new walls and things this week. We hope to have something new for you again next week. And one of these days, we'll have everything in one place. In the meantime, we thank you for coming and hope that you have enjoyed being with us. We hope to see you next week.